Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 19th chapter of John's Gospel. We're going to try and take it a little past the halfway point, verse 22, but we got to review the 18th chapter. And a few things happen in this chapter, namely the Garden of Gethsemane. It's identified as beyond the Quidron Torrent. There was a garden. This is Gethsemane. This is the same place that the synoptics refer to as such, where Judas's betrayal is physically set in motion, and he is turned over to the temple guard, who come with weapons in hand. And in this version, he affirms the answer twice. The first time they fall back when he says, "I am." So there is power in that word. It is divine power, in fact. And Peter draws the sword and takes one of the temple guard servants' ear out. I think it's not identified by name in this one, but it's Malchus and one of the others. And he says, "Why are you doing this? Put your sword into your sheath. Shall I not drink of the cup which my Father has given me?" So Matthew's account is my personal favorite. He says, "He who lives by the sword draws by the sword." But John's emphasis is on the suffering. The cup is the suffering. This is what he prayed for. And the synoptics accounts do provide us more detail as to the cup that he prayed to let it pass from him. Nevertheless, not as I will, but thy will be done. A cup is a cup of medicine. And the paradox is that through the suffering, there is healing to us. Through his suffering, we can be healed and made whole. We also read that Peter confirmed the prophecy given at the Last Supper in the 13th chapter, when the Master frankly foretold that he would deny him 3 times. There's the first one, then there's an interlude with the Messiah being interviewed and interrogated by the high priest, Caiaphas and Annas, but in the reverse order. Then there's 2 of the 3 more denials, but what I really want to focus on in this preamble is his trial before Pilate, because he's found guilty by the Jews, of course. It was a kangaroo court. Every principle of judicial malpractice and equitable jurisprudence was out of the window on that. They tried him at night, first of all, and first thing they do is turn him over to Pilate in about 6 in the morning. And he wants to know why he's here, and he says, he's here because he's a threat. And then Pilate said to him, verse 31, "You take him and judge him according to your law." The Jews said to him, "It is not right for us to put anyone to death," in order that the word of Yahshua might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he was about to die. So the Jews, as a subjected people under the imperial thumb of Rome, wouldn't have been permitted to execute their own. This is something they had to do. The Romans were only able to do, and they had their Mosaic law. There was death penalties attached. And what they found him guilty of was blasphemy. But then in the crowd, they turned to him. They mock pretense, feign sympathy for Caesar, and accuse him of being an enemy of Caesar if he doesn't kill this dangerous radical revolutionary. So their charge to him was that he claimed to be king, and this forms the next question. Yahshua answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Then Pilate said to him, "You are a king then?" Yahshua answered, "You say it because I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to him, "I find no guilt in him." So the first thing we learn is that he comes from a celestial, heavenly kingdom. It is not carnal. It is not of the world. It is not physical. It is spiritual in nature, and it is present and future. His kingdom came with him in the flesh, and it's been with us ever since. It has yet to fully manifest in the millennial kingdom. But it was well within his power to command a legion of angels to just smite those who tried to seize him, but that he was wholly submitted to the Father's will, and it was his will and his compliance that he died. He gave up his life by his own choice in John 10:17-18. But this is all necessary because the kingdom is not of the earth, so it doesn't matter if he is defeated on earth. He is triumphant in heaven by the cross. And, the kingdom, the nature of his kingdom, is one of truth, and those who hear the truth know the truth, and the truth shall set them free, John 8:32. And everything we do is done in truth, and we recognize the voice when we are acquainted with the truth. We will recognize the voice from whom all truth emanates. He is the personification of truth, the way, truth, and the life, John 14:6. But Pilate, he's not a philosopher. He asks what is truth. He doesn't really dig too deep into that. He's just perplexed, but he knows enough to know that he's not guilty. He doesn't merit crucifixion. So what he does is he's convinced that he's innocent. He's determined to let him off. So he offers them a way out. He gives the Passover custom was to surrender one prisoner condoned to death to be liberated, and they choose Barabbas, who was a dangerous, violent agitator, revolutionary, and he was the one that he selected. And the irony of it all is that they accuse him of not being a friend to Caesar when he once more shows resistance. So Pilate is a case study in lack of resistance towards compromise. His sin is one of cowardice and compromise. We'll expound more fully on that as we lean. First verse, 19th chapter, John's Gospel, lesson itself. Then, therefore, Pilate took Yeshua and flogged. So flogging was the customary succession of events after being condemned to crucified. They would flog him, and this means they would whip them. If any of you have seen Passion of the Christ, that's perhaps the most graphic and vivid illustration of what he went through. And the severity of his suffering cannot be, I think words cannot describe the severity. So he was too weak to carry his cross because they beat him so hard. So this was no ordinary beating. And even though Pilate thinks he's innocent, he's being treated like less than garbage by his tormentors, and both Jewish and Roman. And the soldiers plaited a crown of thorns and placed it on his head, and they put a purple robe on him. And they came to him and said, "Greetings, King of the Jews," and they slapped him in the face. So the soldiers, they're exploiting the opportunity to mock him because he is a condemned criminal sentenced to die, and he's already at the mercy. He's already been humiliated by being flogged, and so they add insult to injury by plaiting a crown of thorns, which wouldn't have been that too painful, and especially in reference to the literal floggings that he endured. But it's there for mockery, as is the purple robe. Purple is the color of royalty. And they give him mock deference as the King of the Jews. They're just treating that claim trivially, and they demonstrate how trivially they treat him and the truth and the kingdom by slapping him in the face. The Greek tense is perpetual, so they repeatedly came to him. They did this in motion, repeat motion over and over again. And Pilate went outside again and said to them, "See, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no guilt in him." So Pilate's still looking for a way out. His conscience is somewhat conflicted but ultimately it's political considerations, because Pilate had a controversial record. He was alternately brutal, and this did not augur well between Judeo-Roman relations. And so he thought he could placate the crowd because he was already on their bad side for resorting to excess force. He didn't have the cleanest report card on his governor to the Roman emperor. But he's determined. He's at least resisting at this point. He wants to make it known that he does not approve of the sentence that he consents to. He's doing this as a favor to them, solely to earn their good graces and good faith, which he had a reputation for squandering with excess brutality. Then Yeshua came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to him, "See the man." So Pilate, the governor, introduces the king, with the king with the crown of thorns. So this is a degrading, humiliating throne. It is nothing royal, regal, or splendorous. Neither is the purple. It must have been common and ordinary. Just he's being degraded and humiliated, and that was all part of the plan to accentuate the severity of his suffering so we could understand and appreciate more fully the magnitude of our sin and the penalty that he went through for us. So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they shouted, saying, "Crucify, crucify." Pilate said to them, "You take him and crucify, for I find no guilt in him." So the high priest and the officers, and they have the mob on their corner. They're rallying them up, just shouting at the top of their lungs with utter bloodlust, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate says, he's your problem. Why should I do this? I told you I think he's innocent. But eventually they use the charge of lack of patriotism to ultimately turn him over to their side. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to our law he ought to die, for he has made himself the son of Elohim." Now, to a Roman, that doesn't mean a whole lot of things, because one Elohim is one of many gods to them. They subscribe to the ancient premise of polytheism, according to which the gods of the native nations were to be respected on their territory. So they thought of Yahweh as the king of the Jews, not as the omnipotent creator of the heaven and earth. But where was I? To Jews, this is the charge of blasphemy, which according to Leviticus 24:16 merits the death penalty. So he's got to go because he made himself the son of Elohim. That's a blasphemous claim. And as the religious rulers, they would have had the right and the responsibility to investigate such claims. And of course, their authority was official and legally recognized by Rome. So, even if this itinerant preacher who wasn't the threat that his enemies made him out to be, he consented to their bloodlust after some resistance. So when Pilate heard this, he was more afraid. So remember I said Pilate's sin is cowardice, and that is the motivation of cowardice. He is fearful, and when you are in fear, you cannot live in faith. Fear and faith are two opposite. They're oil and water mixtures, no more than any man can serve two masters. Can fear and faith reside in the same vessel at the same time, simultaneously? So, when we're afraid, it compromises our cognitive capacities. When we are dominated by fear, we become irrational. And when fear destroys our ability to reason and to process, and it just makes us creatures of instinct that go full steam ahead without thinking, without plotting, without calculating. When you are anger, if you can control your anger, good for you. But anger has a way of controlling the angry that we all have to watch out for. Anger and fear are, much the same. Somewhat similar, and went back into the palace and asked Yahshua, "Where are you from?" But Yahshua gave him no answer. So this guy, he's in Jerusalem. He knows that all the Jews from all the world, all the diaspora, come into this time of year. It is Passover when this is taking place. That date is referenced in the 14th verse. And he wants to know where he's from because, he's probably not a native of Jerusalem. But he doesn't give him an answer, and this is probably because he already answered the same question. So it is a principle of divine revelation that if you do not act on the answer, you will lose what you have. But if you act on the answer, you will gain more and progress more. So the greater abundance of personal revelation that is given to you is totally determined by your ability to handle the lesser forms of revelation. So he who can be trusted with little can be trusted with much. So if you make the most out of whatever revelation, illuminatory insight, any thought that's from the Spirit when you're reading the Bible, you will know it instinctively as you become acquainted with him. That is to be cherished, but I'm ultimately deviating far away from the text. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to crucify you, and I have authority to release you?" So the power and life and death is in his hands. He makes it known. He's confident of his power that he yields and his authority, which is granted by Rome. He is the citizen subject of his own people, his own native people who want him dead, and he's the one they have to answer to. So he's reminding him that the power of life and death is in your hand, but he eventually does answer him in response to that question. He does speak up, and Yahshua answered, "You would have no authority against me if it were not given to you from above. Because of this, he who delivered me to you has greater sin." So he's telling him he's at the mercy of the sovereign providence of the Almighty. Every earthly power, every earthly ruler is raised up through his providence, and so there is a higher authority. And this was he was placed by providence in this path to fail as he did, because Pilate ultimately failed in his resolve to save the Savior. But it was all necessary for the plan of salvation. And the other thing that we read in this verse is, he who delivered me has the greater sin. That is not Judas, as is commonly supposed. He's the one who delivered the Messiah to the high priest, but the high priest is the one who delivered it to him. That was Caiaphas, the one who as early as the 11th chapter prophesies that he has to die so that the nation may live. So he was determined to kill him, at least since the rumor of the resurrection of Lazarus. From then on, Pilate was seeking to release him, but the Jews shouted, saying, "If you release this one, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." So Pilate's still trying to wiggle a way out. He's not completely comfortable. His conscience is somewhat conflicted because this man is innocent. He's not the threat that they imagine or suppose, at least not to Rome. But for whatever reason, these Jewish people are irrational about him. He must have thought them superstitious from his lens. But, the power of the mob is shouting, and when the mob is around you, you have to placate it no matter what. So there is, the thing about mob mentalities is decisions are always poorly made by angry mobs. So that where a mob exists, reason ceases to exist. And mob mentality and correct government and justice cannot flourish under the mob mentality or context. But Caesar's friend, now they despise Caesar. They hated living under Roman occupations, and one of the reasons they killed him is because this man who claimed to be their Messiah and would not liberate them from the Roman clutch. But they said, he said he was the king of the Jews. We can twist that into something treasonous against the Roman Empire, and you can't. The title of king could not be granted without the Roman permission. So this was but he didn't deny that he was the king, but he was called the king of the Jews. But that is something he frequently referred to himself as the Son of Man. Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Yeshua out and down in the judgment seat in a place that is called Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. This is the process after he is persuaded fully by these words. He compromises and cowers out to their charge that they're going to use this against him. They're going to report him to Caesar for failing to execute a treasonous claimant who was a usurpation of the emperor and the empire's power and authority. So he takes him down to the place that is identified as the Pavement, and the Hebrew term for that is Gabbatha. And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, "See your king." Excuse me. So the Passover season, he was in Jerusalem to be the Passover, to be the Lamb of Elohim, as proclaimed by John the Baptist as early as in 129 and 136. So everything was pointing to this moment. He was the typological fulfillment of the Paschal Lamb, the sacrificial lamb. And the 6th hour, now there is some confusion about lining up John's calendar of the day with Mark's and the synoptics, but John might have been working from a Roman time, and the time is not important. So it could mean, either 3 I think it's 3 p.m. in Mark, so by the Roman way of measuring time or something else. This does not contradict that. But they shouted, "Away, away, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priest answered, "We have no king except Caesar." So the high priest is the spokesman for this mob, and he tells them that Caesar is our only king. We are loyal, loving, and obedient subjects, and we are doing the right thing in turning over one of our revolutionaries who claims to be king and is going to subvert and lead this rebellion against you. So they were guilty of the sin of cowardice too, because Caiaphas thought that it is better that one man should die than the Romans come in and crush an entire nation in our place. So he was the sacrificial lamb for their status quo. At that time, then, he delivered him to them to be crucified, and they took Yahshua and led him away. So the crucifixion is finally here. This is the hour. This is the hour of which he is referenced as early as John 2:4, when he says, "Woman, my hour has not yet come," when his mother requests him to turn the water into wine. And, they're taking him and leading him away. This is it. They're going to hang him on the cross. Not a pretty picture. John doesn't give as much details on the crucifixion itself, but we're going to cover at least midway through it, and we're going to save what comes after it for a later lesson. We're going to take it all the way up to the 22nd verse, which concludes Pilate's statement. So this can be the part of the chapter in which Pilate is present. And bearing his cross, he went out to the so-called place of skull, which is in Hebrew, Golgotha. So he carried his cross, bearing his cross. It was the customary penalty for crucified victims to carry their cross. It was about 250 pounds on their back to add to the humiliation of their submission to Rome. Crucifixion was not the ordinary capital punishment. It was reserved for threats to the state and people who posed a genuine danger. It was, when we hear of the thief on the cross, he wasn't a common thief. He was, a larcenist of some sort. So, it wasn't the ordinary way. But also people gathered. When we think of public, capital punishment in the United States, it's generally a private affair. It is in a secluded prison. There's not a crowd of people. But in the ancient world, this was excitement and entertainment to see people be crucified. And it's not that they were more sadistic than us. I think it was just that they were less entertained. They didn't have television, so they got a genuine thrill from seeing stuff, that causes a lot of moderns to squirk and squirm even when they see it on the screen. Where they crucified him and two others with him, one on this side and one on the other side, and Yahshua in the middle. So that's all we hear about him in this account, about he was crucified in the middle, and there was one on his right and one on his left behind him, at least in the artistic depiction. But Luke probably gives the greatest details of one of the thief who made the correct confession and was saved in his hour of most exquisite agony, thus giving proof to grace by faith, salvation. But in Matthew's account, he's taunting him with the other one. But in Luke's account, he intervenes in the taunting and says, we deserve this. Don't you know in whose presence you are? Master, remember me when I see in the heaven. When I see you when you come into your kingdom, he says, I assure you this day you will be in paradise with me. But not a whole lot of that's really, we can't really add too much from John's details. And Pilate wrote a title too and was put on the cross, and it was written, Yahshua of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. So this is the sign, because he claimed to be the King of the Jews. He did not deny it. He did not invent that title for himself, but he did not deny that he was a king. His kingdom was not of the earth. He came preaching and proclaiming the kingdom, and so he was the king, because where the king goes, there the kingdom follows with him. And he was, not only the King of the Jews, but the King of kings and Master of masters and God of very gods. Many of the Jews therefore read this title, for the place where Yahshua was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, in Greek, in Roman. So it was a public spectacle. It was made visible and legible, so the people present could read. The crowd gathered around and assembled could make it clear, plain in the three languages. Hebrew was the language of religion, Greek was the language of philosophy, and Latin was the language of law, and all three combined to conspire to kill him. So those forces were in motion in the crucifixion, and they were written on the cross itself. So the high priest of the Jews said to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews," but he said, "I am the King of the Jews." So the chief priest, he's a stickler for the details. He's just petty at this point because the fact that, he's being crucified isn't enough for him. He has to add insult to injury, just that slight detail, he said, so, they didn't want it to be interpreted that he had a claim. But that's just petty and just irrelevant and just beyond pathetic, really. Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." So what's said and done is done and said, and that's all there is to it. He's not going to, just go out of his way any more lengths. He already consented to their request for crucifixion and execution. So anything else at that, you ask too much at this point. I'm done. I've written what I've written. I have ruled reluctantly in your favor. You're not going to get another favor from me today. This is it. This is all. And we'll continue in this chapter sometime soon where we learn the completion of the crucifixion, the death, and the burial, and then the resurrections in the 20th chapter. So that's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.